Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast, and others of you are joining us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Tonight, George Floyd, 1 year later. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We are working with limited staff, and our guests are joining us remotely. Next week will mark the 1 year anniversary of George Floyd's murder on the streets of Minneapolis at the hands of the now convicted Derek Chauvin. Chauvin pressed his knee to Floyd's neck for nearly 10 minutes, snuffing out his last breath. Floyd's killing sparked a communal outrage and a nationwide racial reckoning, including street protests, police reform legislation, and hefty corporate donations to black and brown organizations. Books about systemic racism and anti racism sold millions of copies as the public conversation about race and racism intensified. But what, if anything, has really changed? Joining us remotely, Renee Graham, Associate Editor and columnist for the Boston Globe. Rasan Hall, Director of the Racial Equity Program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Kim McLaren, Professor and Graduate Program Director of Writing, Literature, and Publishing at Emerson College. And Philip Martin, Senior Investigative Reporter for GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting. Welcome to all of you. So I'm going to flip this script just a little bit and start with having each of you identify or expound on one thing that advanced. I'm not going to use the word change because that speaks to a wholesale change, and pretty much all of you have said you don't see that. So within that context, however, some things have adapted, moved, a little bit of advancement, and I want you to speak about that a little bit, and then we'll get to why you think really there has not been wholesale change. So Renee, I note that you pointed to Merrick Garland, the new Attorney General, citing white supremacy in a way that had not been cited before by any other attorney general. Do you see that as an advancement as a result of the George Floyd racial reckoning?
I certainly think it's important. I mean, you have to call a thing, and you can't keep sort of talking around the issue. The problem is white supremacy. So I think if anything is going to change, I'm not saying anything has, you have to at least start with identifying what the problem is. So I do think it's important that Merrick Garland has said that's been said by members of the Department of Homeland Security and talking about the domestic terrorist threat. I think it is important to say that, but then I think it's important to then act on it. It's not enough to say it, but I think it's important to act on it because that's not necessarily what this country does particularly well. But there is a symbol of progress, at least, that people are saying the term white supremacy.
So Black Lives Matter, some believe, Philip, has become more mainstream since the time of George Floyd's death because of those street protests that we talked about. And one thing you've noted is the rise of some new leadership as a result. Is that, in your mind, a kind of advancement since Floyd's death?
Absolutely. I mean, you have in Dorchester, for example, a young woman named Carrie Mays, who emerged from this movement. You have Monica Cannon Grant, who has been around for a while, but basically has made a mark on the city of Boston in terms of asking questions and focusing new attention where perhaps that attention might have been ignored before. It's now in the spotlight. And there, of course, are also older leaders, people who've been around for a long time, but who are basically gaining a new voice, if you will, because they're being paid attention to.
Tell me in the comments, who do you look at when it comes to leadership? Often people look at the older um, black people, whatever, like Jesse Jackson or the Martin Luther Kings, back in those eras, whatever. But who do you look at right now today?
And as for you, Rasan Hall, what about a general better understanding and at least discussion? I recognize action is the second part, but just a discussion about systemic racism. We have a lot of conversations on this show about people not able to grasp that. But in the wake of Floyd's death, there seems to be more of an understanding of what that means?
I think Floyd's death and us being in the midst of a global pandemic where communities of color, and particularly Black communities, were hit the hardest in the aftermath of the 1619 Project, opened up the conversation and discussion around systemic racism. And so when Black folks were taking to the streets protesting police violence, they weren't just protesting police violence, but they were also talking about the disparate COVID infection rates. They were talking about structural and institutional racism and white supremacy and how that impacted those COVID rates, as well as exacerbating the existing educational gaps and wealth gaps. You have groups like BECMA with Segun Idowu being out front saying the reason our communities are going to suffer more from this pandemic are because of generations of structural racism and denial and disenfranchisement. And so the policing protests were just kind of the tip of the iceberg of these larger structural issues that we were protesting.
So, Kim, now you've been pretty strong about beginning at the beginning of this, saying you didn't think that much would come of it. But one of the things that you acknowledge is that there at least is more open conversation, particularly on the part of white people, to deal with some of the real issues of what equity is all about, what systemic racism is all about, as Rasan has said. Is that, in your mind, at least an advancement since the wake of in the wake of George Floyd's death?
Yeah, I knew you saved me for last because I'm the least optimistic about real change coming from that, and I still am. But I do think that there has been movement. Well, let me put it this way: there's less room for denial among people.
Okay, before she actually go into what she about to say, let me know in the comments, what does real change look like to you? I mean, paint me a picture, because as I'm sitting here thinking about it, I can't understand exactly what does real change look like to me. So I'm curious what you have to say.
People, about white people who consider themselves good white folks, right? Well-intentioned liberal folks. There's less room for denial about the reality of the things that we have been talking about for centuries, let alone, personally for decades, right? There, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, there was still wiggle room for people to say, yeah, things are not bad, things aren't great, but, and now I think there's less room for denial. And that's important. The question, of course, is what comes from that. But, you can't drive through a good white neighborhood without seeing Black Lives Matter signs in the front yard still. My question is, who's going to be the first to take those signs down, and when. But so I do think there's progress, and there's other progress. The importance of progressive prosecutors. I mean, DAs, right? The understanding of state and local politics is being really vital. So I think there's definitely been advancement. But as you said, let's see what happens.
All right, now we're going to get to the part where you all get to share your disappointment or just anger about what has not moved in a significant way, as you would describe it. So, Rasan Hall, you're talking about, in your words, a wasted opportunity to really get to some good police reform legislation. There was conversation about it. There was understanding that something needed to change, looking at what happened to George Floyd and in the subsequent incidents. But the actual legislation itself, you say, still falls far short.
Okay, let me know in the comments, what does police reform look like to you? And honestly, do you think, and I mean seriously think, that police reform is something that's actually needed? I'm only saying that because when it comes to police officers and their training, it always manages to work when it's dealing with other people. But for some strange reason, whether armed or unarmed Black people, it never manages to work. So let me know in the comments your thoughts about that.
Yeah, advocates were pushing for so many things, ranging from defunding of police to the elimination of qualified immunity to banning the use of chemical crowd control agents and kinetic impact weapons. And the reform law here in Massachusetts touched some of that. But organizations like the ACLU and many others who were taking to the streets to demand far more reforms than what we saw. and in conversation with legislators and lawmakers to push as far as we could, were overcome by the power of police unions and their rhetoric and fear-mongering. Reductions to the police budget were limited to police overtime, but the reality is that the city is obligated to pay that overtime regardless of what the budget is. So that meant nothing when they cut the overtime budget. Reforms to qualified immunity, which is the legal doctrine which holds police accountable for violating people's civil rights, was barely touched in a way that wouldn't, there's questions as to how meaningful it would be, whereas a state like Colorado eliminated qualified immunity protections for law enforcement altogether. So when we think about these moments of opportunity for reform, we think about a pendulum where it swings one way, and on that upswing, we need to get as much as we possibly can, because we know on the back end, we're going to see regressive politics and policies, rather, that try to undo the very things that we're done. Just look at what we've seen in the aftermath of the Obama administration, the attempts to dismantle affordable health care. So that's what we're probably going to see in policing. So we still need to push, but those are some of the things that we didn't fully see come to fruition in that moment.
Now, Philip, you believe that the movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, needed to have moved away from defund the police, because you thought as a way of expressing the reforms, of characterizing what reform was needed, that actually did not work out so well in terms, and may have impeded the progress that Rahsaan says should have happened.
Well, I think when Rahsaan talks about the pendulum swinging, I think that pendulum was helped by an unhelpful slogan. And the reason I think defund the police is problematic as a slogan is that it's, even though we realize it's nuance, and those who excogitated that notion, that idea, that slogan, are meant it to be nuanced, it's not taken as a nuanced slogan. It's taken it's in a profound way. And so while you might understand something, a slogan like what a difference a DA makes, that is clear, because you're able to basically work with that and to extrapolate from that. When you say defund the police, I'm not surprised that only 28% of Black Americans support that notion, because it's taken, like with many other Americans, as literal. And so when you say defund the police, I think it basically has a problematic impact. It's just not a good, if I were a marketer or PR person, I would say, no, there's no way I would go there, because there's no way of understanding that, unless, of course, you dig very deeply into what that means in terms of reform. So yes, I think it is not helpful, was not helpful, and has served basically as ammunition, if you will, for reactionary forces in the country. They would already find ways to attack the movement. There's no doubt about it. But I think this essentially gave them more ammunition. And I'm not surprised by that Ipsos poll released last week. Ipsos USA poll released last week, showing only 28% of Black Americans support the notion of defund the police.
Okay, Kim, with regard to the Derek Chauvin conviction, there were many people who afterwards said they were relieved that it happened, of course, but look what it took for it to happen. And like you, felt like, okay, it's going to be taken as one thing, but it does not indicate a rethinking about what needs to happen with regard to police reform around these real issues about chokeholds, about immunity, as qualified immunity, as has been raised here, and other issues that have repeatedly been raised by Black Lives Matter activists and others.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, first I want to say I respect my colleague Philip Martin. I totally disagree with him about that. I don't think that the slogan was the issue, right? I mean, I don't want to go too far down that, but I think the slogan is not the issue. The majority of Americans support greater gun control, and yet we don't have gun control, right? So public opinion polls, right? Leadership happens from the front, not from the back, right? No great movement happens when the majority of people agree with it. And defund the police means exactly that, defund defund the police. I'm 100% in support of that because reform doesn't work. We've been trying to reform the police for decades, and this is where we are. So we need to defund. But setting that aside, I do think the Chauvin trial, I think the reason that the police turned on Chauvin was so that he would be convicted rather than policing would be convicted, right? And what we need is to convict the way we police people, especially people of color in this society. And ironically, the Chauvin trial allowed policing to get off, right, scot-free because
You know, I've heard people often say over and over again that we need to stop saying white people or black people because we're all of one race and that's the human race. But my question is, if people truly believe that we were all of one race, the human race, then why is it over policing of one type of human race over the other type? If we're all in this together, then how come all of us is not fighting as a whole to change this? Let me know your thoughts about that in the comments.
Chauvin was convicted. Now, he needed to be convicted, no question. He needed to go. But I think it was the only reason it happened, and the reason that his chief testified against him and so many others testified against him was precisely because they were worried that the larger issue would be examined, and this gave them some breathing room. And I agree with Rashawn that we knew the pendulum was going to swing back, so we needed to push as far as we can. And without, especially qualified immunity, without the ending that, I don't know what happens.
Renee, how do we look at, since George Floyd's murder, all of the many, it's even hard to count how many other incidents, not as horrible as George Floyd, because we witnessed that live, but there are many deaths of unarmed black people, not just black men, and we just keep counting them. They keep adding up. That's in the wake of his death. So what does that say about any movement toward understanding this is a real problem and it has not been solved?
Well, I think it just underlines the need for, and I'm using the term police reform, even though I agree with Kim, the police are beyond reform. There needs to be a radical rethinking of policing in this country, including the concept of defunding the police in the way that you funnel money to areas of the communities that can actually help people and not hurt them. You still have people who are dying. That hasn't changed. But what you also don't see is the kind of national outrage. I feel like people have kind of dropped back to where they were. What happened to George Floyd was so egregious, and we witnessed what happened to George Floyd, that there was sort of no way of getting around to saying that this was wrong. That's why so many police chiefs and commissioners around the country were so quick to run to the first open mic they saw and say, oh my God, this was wrong. He shouldn't have done that. That is not policing. Because what he did was so egregious. I'm not seeing that same reaction with some of the other more recent killings we've seen, because I just don't think people see it the same way. I think there's still a tendency in this country for people to believe, well, if a police officer says, I felt my life was in danger, then he should have to do what he has to do. And, we can't judge the police because we're not in that position. So I think that's one of the big problems. The other problem is, and I was really dismayed a few weeks ago when Congressman James Clyburn from South Carolina said he is not willing to sacrifice the good on the altar of perfect, meaning I'm willing to compromise on the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And if that means getting rid of qualified immunity, he's willing to do that. And I'm sure there are other Democrats who feel the same way. That's completely unacceptable. The bill, in a lot of ways, really hinges on eliminating qualified immunity. And I think what's really upsetting is the idea that these things happen, and then there's this feeling of, well, we'll just settle for what we can get.
Let me know in the comments, when it comes to qualified immunity, can you give me pros and cons about that? I can think of a lot of pros. The only con I can think of is people not willing to become a police officer because of the possibility of what may happen. But if you could think of other things, let me know in the comments.
We've been settling in this country for centuries. When does that end? And when do people say, this is what we want and we have to get this? And we're not going to compromise, and we're not going to get half a bill. If this is the moment, if the pendulum is still in the right direction, then let's get what we can get out of that and make sure it's what really addresses the problem and not halfway accomplishes what we need.
So let me follow up with you, Renee, and ask about the Black Lives Matter sign, the explosion in reading on anti-racism and race and history and culture about African Americans, the corporations stepping forward with these hefty donations to make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a mainstay in their organizations. How do you see that now, a year later?
I see a lot of it as being really performative. I think there was a sense that we have to do something. So we're going to get rid of Aunt Jemima and we're going to retire Uncle Ben because we've just realized now that George Floyd's been murdered that these symbols might be offensive. Like that kind of thing is really kind of in my mind useless. Like the right. I mean, what did that really accomplish? Did that company do anything to change who's in its boardroom? Did they change the people who make the decisions? That's where the real work gets done. I think it's great when went and ran out and bought all these Black Lives Matter signs. And I really hope there were Black people who were capitalizing off of that. But I know, at least in the areas I'm in, I don't see as many signs up because for them, the moment has passed. They don't need to make that statement anymore. Meanwhile, the same issues that led to George Floyd's death, and the same issues for that matter, that led to the disproportionate impact of the pandemic in communities of color, especially with Black people, are still going on. So, yeah, I wasn't terribly impressed by what they did last year because this year proves there was really nothing behind it.
Same question to you, Philip. The signs, the reading, the donations.
I'm not. I agree with Renee in this regard. I think that it's selective amnesia, and it's hardly surprising. I mean, when you have a situation just months ago, January 6th, where history is being rewritten, and now folks who invaded, beat up cops at the Capitol, invaded the Capitol, broke windows, are now being described as visitors. Like any other visitor to the Capitol, and you have large portions of the United States believing that interpretation of reality, it's hardly surprising that they have selective amnesia.
I've heard many different thoughts when it comes to what happened January 6th. Some people say that, oh, it was peaceful. A lot of people claim that they have no recollection of what happened on January 6th. Let me know in your own words in the comments your thoughts about that about that day.
About George Floyd's death and the other deaths that have occurred after George Floyd, and a whole rewrite of Breonna Taylor's situation. You have actually have a cop in Louisville writing a book with a whole different interpretation of what happened with Breonna Taylor and her murder. So it's hardly surprising. Now, at the same time, some of those Black Lives Matter signs remain. One of my colleagues, Marilyn Scherer, photographed a Black Lives Matter sign on a pier not far from her home in Rhode Island. And the reason I mention that is because reactionaries are now not simply looking at these Black Lives Matter signs. Some have actually taken them down, have attacked have attacked people, have assaulted people, have excoriated folks, and then people are trolling across the internet, where you actually have people calling Black Lives Matter a racist movement. So I'm hardly surprised that you have this reaction. It's the very pendulum that Rasan was talking about. And right now, I tend to think that pendulum, by the way, is in the middle. And it needs all the help it can get in terms of how we basically frame our discussion about moving forward.
All right, Kim.
Yeah, I think they said it all. I agree. I mean, you know, even in the real decision is not, the real test is not whether you have a Black Lives Matter sign or, you know, the appropriate books behind you, but what you do on the daily basis. And I can tell you, even in faculty meetings at my beloved Emerson College, right, when issues of you know, his entrenched discrimination and entrenched processes that, you know, give privilege to some and deprivilege others who is bringing up those conversations? It's still the Black folks. It's not the white folks, right? So if you're not in your daily business, if you don't go to your work, your job site, and see the systems that keep it the way it is, and the boardrooms and your jobs, then I don't care how many yard signs you have. You are not being, you're not dismantling white supremacy. So I agree, it's all performative. And the same with corporations. Some of those same corporations that donated money to Black and brown organizations donated money to the people who supported the January 6th insurrection, right? It's both sides of the mouth. So that's all performative, which is what we said a year ago. I said a year ago, we will see, right? But and I'm not impressed. So I'm not impressed by the yard signs or the donations. I want to see substantive change.
Rasan.
Yeah, I can't say much different than what everyone else has said. I want to believe in white folks who are reading these books and putting up these yard signs, but history tells me something different. I think what's really important, though, to Kim's point, and others have said this as well, is like, what are you putting on the line? What sacrifices are you making, particularly in light of the white backlash that is coming to this notion of the pendulum that we keep referencing? What are you doing to stop it from swinging all the way back? How are you engaging with lawmakers? How are you engaging your own corporation where you work and your family members? Showing up to the protests are all well and good, but what are you laying on the line? And I think, to the extent that the Overton window or the window of discourse around race and racism in America has shifted, it's meaningless if it doesn't change the facts on the ground for Black folks.
What would you like to see happen that would be non-performative, Renee?
Well, I think it's been referenced. Let's see what's happening in the boardrooms. I want the notion that white people will be willing to be uncomfortable in doing this work. It can't, the work can't stop to the point where you feel like, well, I don't feel like I want to do that, or that doesn't make me feel good. That's not how anything gets done. So I think there needs to be that real step and that real effort. You can't read your way out of this. All those books that were on the bestseller list aren't on the bestseller list still. So at some point that ended as well. You have to just do the work. And I get emails from people all the time, from white people who say, well, I don't know what to do, or I didn't understand that this was going on. And I don't know how they didn't understand this was going on. And what you do is treat people like human beings. Treat people like you want to be treated. It's not that complicated. But I think when people sit back and feel hamstrung, just like, oh my God, I feel overwhelmed, what can I possibly do? I almost find that very frustrating. There's a lot more you can do than put a yard sign out. You can look at who's on your school board. Look at the people who are running for office. There are things you can do, in your backyard other than put a sign there that can actually affect change.
Kim, do you think that we will move to some non-performative action? Because George Floyd is still very much a marker for a lot of people in this country.
Yeah, I think a friend of mine calls it the Great White Awakening. But it was a shock. But it is dishearteningly easy. I think Rashawn said that for this country to go back asleep. If there was an awakening, we so quickly fall back to sleep. You shouldn't ask me that question because I don't want to be I don't want to bring down the conversation. But I'm not optimistic about America. I'm not. I'm sorry to say that. If you study history, if you see the cycles of history, progress and backlash, progress and backlash, progress and backlash, it's hard to know. It's hard to see what would make this time different than any time before. It's still possible. I want to believe it's possible, but I don't see what would make it different.
All right. Well,
sorry.
Thank you. That's the end of our broadcast and the end of our show. Thanks to all of our guests, and thank you for joining us.
I just have one question I need you to answer honestly for me. Let me know in the comments. Do you think that these conversations are important to have? And if so, why? I mean, do you expect change to come from it? Or is it just to stay informed? And if it's not important, please explain to me in the comments why. But as always, don't forget to like, share, watch more videos, and subscribe to the channel.